What's this chapter called, or what do we normally call it? The faith chapter. Yeah, absolutely. And absolutely perfectly named the faith chapter, right? Although I think as we've come through this, putting this chapter in context, it takes on a little bit different of a light than it does when we just go to it to point out examples of faith. Because the overall point of the Hebrew writer here in the 11th chapter just isn't simply that these individuals had faith and therefore were pleasing to God, or maybe more better put is they were pleasing to God because they had faith. His primary point is that all these individuals forged forward by faith, not looking back or taking the easy route here. Therefore, you as Hebrew Christians, as things are becoming more and more difficult and you're being tempted or pulled back to Judaism, or more particularly probably the culture and the city of Jerusalem at this time, remember that you need to push forward just like these individuals of faith did. So do not draw back. Remember, chapter 10 ends. We are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and preserve their souls. And so this chapter for us then has an application, or a couple of applications that are very useful. Number one is the obvious that we use all the time, that we see what examples of faith look like. The fact that all these individuals acted on their faith. We oftentimes talk about faith as something we believe or something we teach, a set of truths that we hold to. But what we see here in this chapter is faith is something that produces a particular conduct, not a perfect conduct, but a conduct that has a singular aim of pleasing God, finding God's or pursuing God's goals in our life. And so we have listed quite a few of these individuals. You'll recall we start in verse 4 with Abel, verse 5 go on to Enoch, then to Noah, to Abraham, to Sarah, back to Abraham after Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then finally Moses. And that's where we ended. Now, one of the underlying points of Moses here, I think, is really important for the overall point of Hebrews and where he's getting ready to conclude this book, because we're reaching the conclusion of the book, the point of the book. And his points with Moses, and we'll reread these verses to reset the context for us, if we will, is that Moses gained power by giving it up. Right? And what's interesting about Moses is he seemed to understand that he was a leader. He seemed to think he was the individual who was going to deliver the Israelite people. And so what he does is he goes out and he strikes down the Egyptian. And he's going to take charge, right? That doesn't work at all. And notice that action isn't given as a faithful action in this passage. Rather, everything that Moses did to lay power down is what gained power for him. It's kind of like Mark the 10th chapter, where James and John are arguing over who's going to sit on the right and left-hand side of Jesus in his glory. And he said, if you want to be great, you're going to have to be a servant, right? the night of, just a week later, night of the Last Supper, just hours before Jesus is betrayed, the disciples are sitting around arguing about the same thing. Who's going to be the greatest? And Jesus starts to wash their feet. I don't know how we could have a more touching example of servitude than with everything Jesus had to have on his mind, getting ready to face the cross. He starts to wash feet because they aren't getting the point. 3.5 years and they still don't understand. It's pretty easy for us to be critical of them, but how often in our life do we get intent on seizing power, right? Grabbing power, making it happen our way. And everything about Jesus is the opposite. Questions or comments on that overview before we read these couple verses? Then I'll read. We aren't going to get back into depth at 23 through 28, but I'll read this with that in mind of what I just said about how everything Moses is referred to here is laying down power. Starting in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and that they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. And so there's our example of faith. And when we get to Moses, we see that statement several times, right? By faith. And now we're going to really draw out the contrast of this idea. What we've seen so far is a lot of action, right? In this statement. By faith, action. By faith, action. Now what the Hebrew writer is going to bring out is it wasn't the action that saved them. It was the faith. 29 and, verse 29. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. It's not the action, is it? The Egyptians tried to do the exact same thing that the Israelites did. What was the difference? I guess.
Were able to escape and go across, and when the Egyptians tried to do the same thing, they got smacked and they drowned.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, Mike, it's an obvious answer, but you even hit the more obvious answer, I guess, than what I was thinking. They drowned is the difference. The Egyptians drowned. But you go around to the answer I was looking for, too, the difference as well as, or why they drowned versus the Israelites walking across, was faith, right? So it wasn't walking through the Red Sea that saved them. It was the fact that they did that by faith, that God had asked them to walk through the Red Sea. When the Egyptians tried to do the very same thing, they were killed. I think that bring that application home, I'm talking about gaining power by laying power down. If we do that separate and apart with God, we're just simply going to die, right? We're going to lose more power. It is through God, or it's by faith, that all of these things take place. Verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. He's kind of drawn this idea to a point that's the faith. It's really, when we say faith, it's not even the faith, right? It's God. It's their faith in God that's given them access to these wonderful works. He's going to bring that home, why it's important to all these people. 31. And with this, he's going to start to open up another aspect of these people's character. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. He's really, I think, drawing out this idea that wasn't their actions, right? Notice she doesn't, she doesn't. He doesn't say Rahab, who used to be a prostitute. What was she when she was saved from the destruction? She was a prostitute, yeah. It's interesting, some of the very people that we would, most avoid associating with are the very people that God, sought out. And I say that more because of what we read about Jesus. These are the people, prostitutes, or who he was accused of hanging out with. Those and tax collectors, right? And she was saved, not with the disobedient. Now, the disobedient, I think, is really getting at this point. Disobedient to what? (31) again reads, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Okay. Which, if we came back to Acts, the 3rd chapter, the word believe and obey are very close. King James tends to translate it believe. But that, I guess that makes it more difficult to answer the question I asked, right? Those who did not believe, is that what the King James reads? Is that? Okay. So they disbelieved God, right, in their action, essentially. That does make the point a little more vague. Is that a siren going off down there? It still is overall the same point where we are going to go next. These people were disobedient to God. They were not submitting to his law, right? Where Rahab submits to the law. The reason that disobedient jumped out at me, and I missed the fact that the King James uses obey there, but one of the reasons disobedient jumps out at me, with the exception of Moses, what does every one of these examples have in common? From Rahab, I meant to say from Abel through Rahab. Abel, before or after the law was given? Abel lived before or after the law? Before. I was going to say, if we don't get that one down pat, we're in trouble, right? Enoch, before or after? Before Abraham? Sarah? Who was next? Isaac? Jacob? Joseph? All before, right? Why is that significant? God's chosen people were not yet set apart? Yeah. What's about to come to an end? What are they tempted to go back to? The old law. There's a reason the Hebrew writers drawn out all these people that were faithful and saved before the law. Because there is something deep within them that says, well, I can't let go of this. I've got to go back. I've got to protect Jerusalem. I've got to keep, and bear in mind that many of these Christians still practiced in nearly its entirety the old law. The New Testament did not forbid them from doing such. So they're still going through all the customs of the old law. It was how they were taught their entire life, you were righteous before God. And he actually started this idea several chapters back, but the Hebrew writer is drawing out this idea that they were all before the law. In fact, most of Moses' examples there, even Moses himself, that was all before the law, wasn't it? And then we're going to go back to examples that took place after the law. In the book of Judges and Joshua is where we're going to spend the next couple references going to. So I think it's something he's really drawing out to these people is that all these were saved before the law. God was before the law. God will be after the law. And of course, he'd spent all this time saying that Christ has fulfilled it and is superior. Questions or comments before we start into 32? Corey.
Story, I guess, if you want to say, for Rahab. But she seems to stand out different from all the other examples that we had. Because she was in the city, basically she just hit a couple guys, you know? I mean, where's the faith really come there, you know? Maybe I'm just not remembering from the Old Testament what it says, but from what I can remember, it's kind of like she just did a good deed, not so much did she show faith.
Okay, I'll come back to your question. I want to draw out the statement you made in the beginning of it first, because I thought you were going to bring something out that I'd forgot to mention, and then you said she seems different, and she was, but you didn't, in my mind, hit the way she was most different. And we already talked about her being a prostitute, but there was another way where she was really, really different. She was a pagan, right? Yeah, and Rita says she wasn't a child of God, and we kind of talked about all these samples being before Judaism, but she's a pagan, right? She's on the other side. And Corey says, what'd she do? Am I understanding you right? I think that's why the Hebrew writers really draw, it's by faith. Right? It's not by keeping that law. You know, they had so narrowed down in their mind, and for just causes, that This is how you're saved, by keeping this law. The law saves. The law is how you're pleasing to God. And the Hebrew writers, using their own scriptures, say, wait, there's a bigger picture here. Not only were all these people saved by faith without the law, in our Romans study, Romans 4 really kind of draws that out, that Paul really draws this concept out in Romans. That's not the law. In fact, Abraham was considered righteous before circumcision. And so now we're going even a step further with drawing Rahab out. And what did she do? That's the point. It was by her faith. So the story is Jericho, they're surrounding Jericho, they send the spies in, they need to escape, and she just simply gives them safe haven, slides them out the window, and helps them to escape. That was it. Okay.
Started watching that on chapter 2. By the way, I liked how you really wiped your nose when you were reading chapter 2, telling your story about being in a store. I mean, COVID and wiping your nose, that was really good. Yeah. Anyhow, now let's go back to this. So we would say, or people would say, that by reading this chapter, okay, we would say that there is, faith with action, or an obedient faith. Okay? And that's where then you get people that's talking about faith alone. Okay?
Did faith say that last part again?
About people will say faith alone.
Okay.
That all you need is faith alone, that's what saves you. So when you read this chapter, you can say, with most of these people that if, that yes, there's faith, but if they wouldn't have obeyed, they wouldn't have been saved. Okay? But then you get to Rahab, where she didn't do anything. It was just faith. So those that would say faith alone would say there's a perfect example of somebody that was saved by faith alone. What would you say about that?
What would I say about that? I probably will slightly offend people on each side of that equation. I believe it is faith that saves us. Most of my life, I put too much emphasis, I believe, on action. And I think really that example of the Egyptians drowning when they did the exact same thing that the Israelites did really emphasized that. Now, what is faith? That's the other question. And really, it caught me off guard, and I'm sorry it did, because what Rita brought out with the difference in terminology in the King James and the ESV really is a helpful thing. They're really more synonymous than what we make them out to be. If I have faith, I am going to act on what I'm told to do. The point I think that Scripture makes, Romans particularly, soundingly, is that action doesn't save me. It's the fact that I'm acting in faith. It's God that saves me because I'm being obedient. And Rahab's kind of this in-between person, because we're going to point out the significant flaws of several of the examples that follow after. So what we're going to see is these next people are named faithful, and yet they're kind of some pretty rough characters, if you say that. You'd say they're not godly. In fact, that's one of the examples we see about Lot. You think about Lot's sin, I mean, it's hard to stomach the fact the New Testament refers to him as righteous. What saved him? His life, he had a grievous mistakes, but he lived by faith, meaning his purpose was God. His aim was God. So is it faith alone? if you're going to go that far, you've got to say it's God alone that saves us. And he asked us to respond in faith, and those are the ones he saves. So did I hit the middle of those where neither side will agree with me? You know, I think that's kind of where I find Scripture to lie in my mind. Rita.
With Rahab, she acknowledges God. She says he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. So, yes, she only did a little thing, but she was already believing in God when she did those things.
Which is, I am so glad you said that, because it's the point that I was trying to draw out. While the action is so small, it's why she does the action that makes it significant. It was evident to her. And when we say the action was small, she betrayed her people and allowed all of her friends to die. The consequences of her actions weren't small, right? But she believed that was going to happen regardless because of what Rita just read. So the action, while it's small because it's faith, is what she's commended for. Because it's done in faith, excuse me. Anything else? So as I kind of led up to this idea, would someone read for me 32 through 38, please?
Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies in flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, affliction, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect.
Okay, thank you. Those last two verses are kind of summary. Set those aside for just a moment. But that gives you where we're going with this in the end point. So some think that the book of Hebrews is really a sermon that was given and was written down then after the fact. Because of this statement in 32, and what more should I say, for time would fail me of. And to me, I don't think that's necessarily strong evidence that this is a sermon. I think it simply could be meaning, hey, I'm not going to take the time, effort, paper to write about great detail of these. I've already proven the point, and now I'm going to reference in short these individuals. So who do we mention, or who do we reference? We come back here to Judges 6, and this list, to me, I think is drawing out this idea we've kind of introduced with Rahab. Gideon is in Judges 6 and 7, right? And Gideon doesn't just blindly act when God asks him to take up arms against their enemies, does he? What does he do? Test. He asks for signs. And then God gives him the sign. He still doesn't want to do what he's supposed to do. And so he says, well, how about the opposite, God? Could you still do it? Now, does that sound like faith? Well, what about Barak? He wouldn't go. Nay, it's a shame Debbie's down. Well, it's a good thing Debbie's in her class downstairs. I'm sure she's enjoying it. But who would Barak not go to war without? Do you remember? There was probably a reference. I mentioned your sister, right? Yeah. That was great. Barak was a different individual, huh? Barak would not go into war without Deborah. And it said that history will remember that, right? Does that sound like faith? What a mighty warrior he is. Can you imagine, Brad, you're being held up and you tell Marissa, I'll get out of the car if you get out. You wouldn't say that, would you? No. Does that sound like faith? Well, I think the point is he still does it, right? Imperfectly. Very kind of important. Samson, wow. I've given kids lessons on Samson. That's not a kid-friendly story, right? Samson's not a kid-friendly individual. He's not someone you'd let babysit your children. That's Judges 13 through 16. And boy, he did a lot of things wrong. But what about this next guy from Judges 11, Jephthah? Recall who he is? I will sacrifice the next thing that comes through that door to you. His daughter. He makes the list. At least it would seem that that's who we're talking about. I'm not giving a last name or Bible reference, but we're right there in the book of Judges with the rest of all these. David, right? David's mistakes of adultery and murder are well known. Samuel seemed to be an individual. His children rebelled and they perverted the law in terrible ways, right? Political corruption isn't something new to our age, is it? Here's an early case of political corruption, a big case. And Samuel's condemned for, not condemned, but rebuked by God, rather, for not restraining his sons in doing this. Sound like great examples of faith? Again, I think his point is twofold. It's obviously this idea that this was done without the law, right? There's a reason. He could have found lots of samples within the law. Of course, David is an exception to that, right? We just mentioned David in that list. But rather, he gives these very imperfect examples because the emphasis is that God is the ultimate victor. Bear in mind, if we come back to Abraham, and I want to tie this point in, verse 17, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise was in the act of offering his son, of whom it was said, though Isaac shall your offspring be named. Verse 19, he considered that God was able to raise him from the dead. What's the point here? Abraham's faith was on God, not the promise. Why is that relevant for them? Because their faith, their eyes need to be on God, not Jerusalem. Did they receive wonderful blessings through Jerusalem? Yes. But guess what? It was God that gave them the blessings all along. Relevant for us today? Maybe. In a very abstract, foreign way, right? Maybe not so abstract after all. So all these examples were given in that way. Questions before we go into what they did. So we could go through, I could give you a long list of Bible verses where these things happen, but notice what they did. They conquered kingdoms. They enforced justice. They obtained promises. They stopped the mouths of lions. Give me one example of that. Stopped the mouths of lions. Daniel, right? And David would be the other obvious one, right? And Samson would be another. But there's examples of many of these along the line. Quenched the power of fire, obvious one, right? Daniel 3. Escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by the resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release. They were so that they might raise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. King James says they were tempted. Is that not correct? They were tempted. The difference in translation there, the word that's translated tempted is actually the Greek for tambourine. You know what tambourine looks like? It referred to the drum-like instrument that bodies were stretched out over to be flogged or sawn in two. By the way, with a wooden saw in most cases. They were sawn in two. They were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. Let's stop for 38 here. Anyone feeling like they worthy of complaining tonight? Anyone have it really rough and persecuted for Christ? Something worth mentioning tonight? No. That we aren't going to go there, right? What about the flip side of this? You know, we've been talking the last couple of Sunday mornings about potential. Notice their potential. What they accomplished were unthinkable tasks. By what? By faith. You know, we talked, is it faith or action? They're inseparable. Right? But their lives here were very, very difficult. Questions on what they accomplished or what they suffered? 38 then, of whom the world was not worthy. Or, what does that mean? They were too good for the world, right? Wow. You want to aim for something to be said of you at your funeral? There it is, right? The world was not worthy of them. Amazing statement. Their conduct, their efforts had shown them to be so. Bear in mind, this includes those very imperfect examples we're talking about. The point of the whole chapter is, what made them that way is their eyes were set on something above. I think that's relevant for us in this way, and this is the overall point for the Hebrew writer. We can't profess faith in God or in Jesus and have our eyes set on what things are below. What What's our goal? What's our aim? What's important to us? Is the implication of what he's saying. But this is the next thing. They did not receive what was promised. Ooh, you talk about stinging comment. Well, they had received kingdoms, hadn't they? They had received the promised land. They had received promised land, kingdoms, victories, right? Deliverance. They had received a lot of these things, hadn't they? What had they not received? The Messiah, Jesus. The Messiah. It was what it was all pointing towards. It was the whole purpose of the Old Testament. They all did something, all these great works, pointing forward to something they didn't see. Verse 40, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. I spent most of my life thinking, I wish I had miracles. I wish I lived in the age of miracles. Wish I got to be next to Jesus. You know what Jesus said to his disciples in John? I've got to go so something better can come. Wow. My intent is after we talk about potential for a couple weeks on Sunday mornings, to talk about what we are in the church, our value in the church. We're better than angels. We're better than the prophets. We are better, have better works than Jesus Christ himself while on earth. These are all statements Scripture says. Wow. I think when we grasp that, when we embrace that, we'll have something. We'll know we have something, and we'll act in a way that we know we have something. Because that's amazing. That apart from us, they should not be made perfect. I believe he's talking about the age. He's talking about the promise. It's the Christian age that brings about forgiveness. It's Christian age that we talked about Sunday morning in Ephesians 3:10 that will show the manifold wisdom to principalities and powers in heavenly places. What was that? I left out an important word. Through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be shown. Right? What he's saying to the Hebrew writer is don't think about going back. You are living in the pinnacle of all time. The pinnacle of all ages. You know, we talk about the last days, right? People talk about the last days and all the awful things. Well, guess what's part of the last days, too, as well? The church, the Christian age, forgiveness of sins. Wonderful thing. All right, 1 and 2. I'm undecided on how I feel. It doesn't matter how I feel about the chapter break here. But really, 1 and 2 of chapter 12 is still on the same theme as we're just dealing with here. But on the other side, it does seem good, appropriate to break apart Jesus Christ from these other examples. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12, and we'll conclude with this tonight. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of the faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Well, therefore, because of this, we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. There's a lot of imagery. Scripture is full of imagery. The Hebrew mind and Hebrew language was about pictures and images. When you talk about the great cloud, what comes to mind? Yeah, through the wilderness. Starts at Sinai and guides them through the wilderness. It was the presence of God, right? That's the imagery that he's drawing back. All these references to the Old Testament has them thinking in that way. And he says this great cloud of witnesses. He's referring to the presence of God guiding us through these great examples. Lay aside every weight and run with endurance the race. I can't help but think, being that we are on the brink of the destruction of Jerusalem, that there's also not imagery here. There's a greater spiritual implication, but there's imagery of what they're physically going to have to do and what they've been told they're going to have to do. Drop all their belongings and get out of town. Right? How many of you, if you were told to survive, you have to not go home, get in your vehicles, and go to a foreign place right now, would not be tempted to go home and get at least a couple things? Corey wants to go home and get that $78,472 out of his safe in cash. Combinations 1432, right? Yeah, that's essentially what they're, in just a couple years, they're going to have to do. Right? And what he's doing, I believe, is using the imagery of what they're going to physically have to do to escape Jerusalem. And in escaping Jerusalem, they're showing the faith of God, just like all these other people have done in their action. But there's this greater spiritual application for you and I, that whatever's holding us down, let go of it and run the race. Because there's something greater at stake than what we have in our hand. And we do that looking. Dad, you could always tell when you're at the rodeos, when I was rodeoing, you could always tell the kid that was going to hit the ground right out of the gate, right? Besides me. They almost always look, right? And you'll see someone, even not so much professionally, but you'll see people at local rodeos. They'll be riding, things are going, and you see their head turn. And that's where they go. Where we put our eyes is of the utmost importance. Right? Start a runner, endurance race, looking behind them, or look. That is the imagery that he's using. Put your eyes on Jesus Christ. Don't get caught up in the career. Don't get caught up in the debt. Don't get caught up in the struggles of the day, or the pandemic, or the election, or the family fights, or the friends arguing. Put your eyes on Jesus Christ and go. That's what he's saying. And then here's what he ends with, and what I'll end with tonight. Our kids still aren't back there, but we'll shut down all the same. We used all these great examples. Now he says, here's the perfect example. Jesus Christ, who put his eyes on the joy of the cross and despised everything else. You know, when I said, does anyone feel like complaining? We hadn't even got to Jesus Christ yet, right? There's the example. There's the encouragement. May your eyes be fixed on the author and finisher of our faith. May you run with endurance this week. Thank you.